Welcome to Things You Don't Know. Today, we're opening part one of our discussion on sycophants. Yeah, sycophants. What the word originally meant, what it means now, whether people are born this way or shaped into it, what this kind of behavior does to a person from the inside out, and how it can spread through leadership circles and groups. I am joined by Professor Deneen, our historian, Chandler Foster, who brings some concerns and insights of the younger generation. He's a recent graduate of one of my alma maters, Emory and Henry University. And we are absolutely so fortunate to have a special guest, MJ, whose background in computing, engineering, and systems thinking gives us another lens on how distorted human behavior can warp whole institutions. The modern English definition is very blunt. A sycophant is a servile, self-seeking flatterer, someone who praises people in power, in particular, to gain approval. Of course, financial opportunities and gaining power or control over others also plays a significant role.
That older life of the word matters, ladies and gentlemen, because the history of the word tells us something about the history of power. In ancient Greek, the word sycophantes referred more to a slanderer, an informer, or a malicious accuser than to a flatterer. The exact fig explanation has been debated for a long time, but one long-standing tradition linked the word to someone who showed or exposed figs, possibly by informing on illegal fig export or some other petty accusation.
But fig, they had a sign for fig, and it was very similar to what we use today as what we call flipping someone the bird. You know, when you hold your middle finger up and the other two fingers nicely curled out so that it kind of gives you a picture of a kind of anatomical portion of people. And it really means screw you. I'm sorry, go ahead, Dr. Neen.
That's a nice way of explaining it. But what matters most is by the time English borrowed the term in the 16th century, the meaning had shifted away from informer and toward the sort of person hanging around the powerful, currying favor, flattering upward, attaching themselves to influence. The best example I know is Master Rich in the film A Man for All Seasons about Sir Thomas More.
Well, I know some other examples, but I bet you, Chandler, you have some things to say about this.
I sure do, Dr. Weaver. So, this word didn't just start out as meaning kiss up, but it moved in that direction because the kind of person who stays close to power often does more than just one bad thing. They may accuse rivals, spread gossip, flatter leaders, and try to rise by attaching themselves to somebody stronger than they are. That makes the term feel surprisingly modern. A lot of younger people hear the term sycophant and think a person who has stopped being real, a person who has stopped saying what they actually think and started performing loyalty for reward. That straight up performance aspect feels central to the modern meaning. You can see versions of it everywhere. There's the employee who laughs too hard at the boss's weak joke because he wants to be noticed. There's the political aide who keeps saying, "Oh, that speech was brilliant," even when it clearly fell flat. There's the student organization member who praises the club president in public but privately rolls their eyes, knowing the praise is strategic. The details change, but the patterns stay the same.
Yeah, and that performance point is very important. In psychology, a related concept is ingration. That means efforts to win liking and approval, especially through deliberate impression management. In other words, sycophancy is not just admiration, it's strategic, it's often calculated. The person may be trying to look safe, useful, loyal, agreeable, or indispensable to someone above them. In systems terms, that's a feedback distortion. The message going upward is no longer true. It is whatever the receiver most likes to hear. In a workplace, that might look like a manager asking, "Is this realistic by Friday?" And everybody's saying yes, because no one wants to sound difficult. In politics, it might be a staff members telling the leader a policy is connected with the public when the private numbers show the opposite. In everyday life, it can be as simple as someone constantly telling a strong personality, "Oh, you're always right," because staying in favor feels easier than being honest or to avoid negative attention to themselves.
Yeah, well put. Let's put the direct answer even more plainly, perhaps, because this is one of the questions that needs to be answered just so clearly here. A sycophant is not simply someone who respects a leader or likes a boss or agrees with a professor, president, or movement. A sycophant is a person who exaggerates praise, hides disagreement, and often reshapes their public behavior to please power and gain something from it. That something might be safety, status, access, promotion, protection, money, or a feeling of belonging. Honest loyalty says, I support you and I'll always tell you when you are wrong, which is one of the things that I really like about our team here is that these guys, that's not apparent always in the podcasts, but they will tell me, uh, you could do that better, or maybe that wasn't the best, or
Well, Dr. Weaver, you're the type of leader that makes us secure, makes us feel secure in doing that.
Absolutely. You don't want people to tell you what you want to hear. You want to focus on what's best for the
And you're
podcast.
safe.
absolutely. You know, surrounding yourself with ass kissers, which is another term for sycophants, is dangerous. So a sycophancy, it says, I need your approval more than I need the truth. That is the clean difference. If an advisor says, Mr. President, I back you, but this plan has some serious weaknesses. Now that is loyalty with honesty. If that same advisor says, oh, this is genius, sir, mainly because they want access or protection, that begins to enter sycophancy. In a family setting, a loyal relative might defend somebody, but still say privately, you know what? You need to apologize. A sycophant type relative says, you did nothing wrong, even when everyone knows better. What do you think about all that stuff, Chandler?
Well, I think it can be very dangerous, Dr. Weaver, and that distinction really matters for younger people entering workplaces, politics, nonprofits, schools, and media spaces. A lot of people are not trying to become morally hollow, they're just trying to survive. They learn that the person with authority rewards agreement, punishes dissent, and remembers who embarrassed them. So some people slide into flattery not because they woke up wanting to be a sycophant, but because they learn that honesty is expensive. A new employee may notice that the people who get promoted are the ones who always praise the boss's ideas. A graduate student may realize that challenging a famous professor in public carries social cost. A junior political staffer may see that the people who keep their jobs are the ones who reassure the leader, not the ones who bring unwelcoming facts. Under those conditions, Flattery can start feeling less like a vice and more like a survival tactic.
History supports that, Chandler. Courts, political parties, royal households, dictatorships of all kinds, and bureaucracies have repeatedly produced people who learn to read power before they read principle. In such settings, the careerist is often not the wisest person in the room. It is the most adaptive flatterer. That does not mean that every agreeable person is a sycophant, but it does mean environments can cultivate this behavior quite efficiently. The story repeats because the incentives repeat. In royal courts, courtiers learned very quickly which moods of the king and queen were safe to reinforce. In authoritarian states, officials often learned that accurate reporting could be dangerous if it contradicted official optimism. In modern organizations, the same pattern may be less dramatic but still real. The person who protects leadership from embarrassment may rise faster than the person who speaks plainly.
Well said. This brings us to the next question. Are sycophants born that way, or are they made into sycophants? The most responsible answer is kind of messy and complex. It's this. Usually both temperament, in other words, how they were born, their own makeup, their personality, and the environment, what they are exposed to and what they feel like they have to deal with, go into it. But sycophancy is far more learned and reinforced as a pattern than a fixed essence. Some personal traits may make a person more vulnerable to this behavior, but context matters greatly. Ambiguity, dependence on leadership, fear of consequences, and a system that rewards upward flattery all help to produce it. MJ, maybe you could take us to the engineering side and make it more clear in common language.
Sure. Engineering language, I'd say sycophancy is rarely something a person is born with. I have to agree with you on that. It is more often a behavior adaptation operating with a particular environment. Some personalities may be more approval seeking, anxious, shy, status conscious, or power oriented. But if you place these people in a culture where disagreement is punished and performance loyalty is rewarded, that behavior can quickly intensify. A person who might have been merely polite in a healthy system can become a flatterer in a coercive or highly political one. Think of two versions of the same employee. In one office, the boss says, "Tell me what I'm missing," and rewards candid feedback. That employee may become thoughtful and direct. In another office, the boss snaps at anyone who disagrees and praises people who echo him. The same employee may begin with holding doubts, then praising ideas they don't believe in, then volunteering admiration they do not feel. And that same person, different environment, very different behaviors.
Now, that's actually reassuring in one sense, MJ, because it means that people are not doomed by the nature to be this way. But it's also sobering because it means that many ordinary people can slide down into it. They can become fake by inches. First, they laugh at what isn't funny. Then, they withhold a concern. Then, they echo a view that they don't really hold. Then, their public self and their private self drift apart. And that's just not political here, folks. That can happen in families, on campuses, in workplaces, in friend groups, and in online communities. A person in a friend group may stop objecting when the dominant personality mistreats someone because they don't want to lose standing within the group. A young person online may start repeating whatever the influential figure says because disagreement leads to dogpiling or jumping on the bandwagon. It often begins with small compromises, not dramatic corruption.
Yeah, I like that dog piling reference, Chandler. Jumping on the bandwagon. Yeah,
Yes,
kind of
sir.
joining in with everybody else. Yes, and it's a drift, as you say. It starts with an inch, and then it goes a mile. That drift takes us to the personal damage sycophancy does. Psychologically, one of the clearest harms is self distortion. A person starts suppressing their real judgments, their real values, and sometimes even their perception of reality to stay aligned with authority. When people habitually hide their authentic views to protect themselves or gain favor, the pattern can be emotionally exhausting. It can produce inner conflict because, well, look at it. The person is performing or showing the world oneself while silencing the other, keeping it hidden.
Yeah, Dr. Weaver, that makes perfect sense. Running two selves at once is costly. One self is an internal monitor that notices contradictions. The other is the external avatar, or how the person presents themselves to others, which demonstrates loyalty. That split burns energy. It doesn't mean every flatterer becomes clinically depressed or emotionally depleted in the same way, but sustained falseness is not psychologically free. Think about the mental effort involved in constantly tracking the leader's mood. Remember which opinion is safe, editing your own speech, and pretending enthusiasm you do not feel. That is a lot of processing overhead. In computer terms, too many resources being devoted to appearance management rather than reality testing. A person may start the day asking not what is true, but what is safe to say. Over time, the difference between reality and acting safely blurs appropriate thought and activity and damages clarity.
There's also moral damage. The sycophant may begin by flattering the powerful, but the long term cost is usually a shrinking of integrity. Historical records are full of people who became unable to tell whether they still believed what they said. Once a person is rewarded for echoing power, truth starts to feel dangerous, and conscience starts to feel inconvenient. That is how institutions lose not only honesty, but character. The damage is not only public, it is private and cumulative. A court official who keeps praising bad decisions may slowly stop recognizing his own cowardice. A party loyalist may begin by excusing one obvious lie for strategic reasons and end by defending a whole pattern of deception because admitting the truth would also mean admitting their own complicity.
And from a younger generation point of view, there's another cost: cynicism. When you watch people succeed by flattery instead of competence, you start wondering whether honesty is for fools. And that's a corrosive lesson for any generation. It teaches people that the path upward is not insight or courage, but performance. And when enough people learn that lesson, you get a whole culture where nobody trusts anyone else's public speech. People start assuming that every compliment is strategic, every show of loyalty is fake, every public statement is crafted for advantage. That kind of atmosphere doesn't just hurt politics or workplaces, it hurts friendship, mentorship, and trust itself. And I have to say, it's hell on your mental health, too.
Yeah. And hell on the organization and on the group of people that it's being presented to. I also want to underline another damage that sometimes gets overlooked. A sycophant can become less competent over time. If you are always adjusting your words to please authority, you may stop practicing independent judgment. You stop sharpening your ability to evaluate evidence honestly. You stop building courage. You also stop learning how to disagree constructively. In effect, the muscles of honest thought begin to weaken. That can make a person look successful in the short term while become shallower in the long term. A person may gain favor but lose substance.
And there's a systems level irony there. The sycophant often thinks this behavior is making them safer, but also can make them more fragile. Their identity becomes tied to the approval of a single person or a single structure. If the leader falls, if the culture changes, if truth suddenly matters again, the sycophant might find they've neglected the very qualities that endure: competence, steadiness, judgment, credibility. People may tolerate a flatter while the system rewards them, but they rarely place deep trust in one.
That is why so many
Mhm.
historical eras show a tragic pattern. Sycophants often look influential and important, while the regime, court, party, or institution is functioning on appearances. But when a crisis comes, the flatterer's limitations are exposed. The person who built a career on approval rather than on truth has little to stand on once reality begins pressing in.
So, in plain language, being a sycophant damages a person by making them less real, less honest, less brave, and sometimes even less capable. It can wear them down emotionally, twist their moral compass, and teach them to depend on somebody else's approval more than their own judgment. And that is a very high price to pay for access or favor.
Oh, yes, well said, Chandler. Now we need to bring in two closely related ideas that help explain how sycophancy spreads beyond the individual and begins to affect entire groups and leadership circles. The first is what people often call the bubble effect. Now, the bubble effect is what happens when a leader or a group leader becomes surrounded by people who keep filtering reality for them. The person at the center stops hearing the unvarnished truth. They hear softened truth, selected truth, flattering truth, or no truth at all. The bubble is made of praise, fear, silence, ambition, and selective reporting. Once that bubble forms, the leader may think they are well informed, when in fact, they are being insulated from reality.
I totally agree. In systems language, the bubble effect means the feedback loop is breaking down. Imagine a pilot whose instruments are being quietly adjusted so every warning looks serious than it really is. Or imagine a computer dashboard that only displays the good metrics and hides the failures. The user at the center still thinks they are operating on full information, but they're not. In political life, this can happen when advisors stop bringing bad news because bad news is unwelcome. In an office, it could be happening when the employees tell management, "Oh, everything's going great," while morale is collapsing. In a friend group, it can happen that a dominant person is never told they're rude, selfish, or driving people away because other fears the reaction.
And history shows, ladies and gentlemen, that once a bubble forms around a ruler or a leader, people inside that bubble often start competing not to tell the truth, but to tell the leader what the leader most wants to hear. They call that working towards the Fuhrer in Nazi Germany. That is one of the places where sycophancy becomes more than a personality flaw. becomes a structural pattern. The bubble protects the leader from discomfort, but also from correction. That means errors last longer, bad decisions spread further, and reality has more time to punish everybody involved.
And from a younger person's point of view, Dr. Deneen, that bubble effect can happen in smaller settings too. It can happen in a campus group, in a club, online, or even in a hobby community. One person becomes central, admired, or intimidating. Then people start shaping what they say around that person's reactions. Soon, the group is no longer organized around the original purpose. It is organized around managing the emotional weather of the person in the
Oh,
middle.
yeah, that's a very, very apt description there, Chandler. That leads us directly into another thing, group think. Now, this one needs to be explained very clearly because people use the term and the word very loosely. A groupthink is not just about people agreeing. People can agree for good reasons. Groupthink occurs when the desire for harmony, acceptance, or unity becomes so strong that people stop properly questioning bad ideas. In groupthink, people begin to censor themselves, ignore doubts, and act as if silence means agreement. They also start becoming more radicalized, if you will, in terms of whatever the group is thinking about. We'll get into that a little bit more in just a minute here. The group sort of starts valuing belonging over accuracy. And that's really the key mechanism. Maybe, MJ, you bring it down into plain language a little better than I can.
Yeah, and to make that very plain, here is how groupthink often works step by step. First, a person joins a group for one reason. Let's say it's bread making group. They join because they like sourdough starters, yeast, ovens, crust recipes, and maybe talking about flour hydration. At the beginning, that is what the group is about. Then certain people in the group became more influential. Maybe they are more vocal, more confident, or just more socially dominant. Then those people start signaling not just baking opinions, but other attitudes. Maybe complaints about neighborhood noise or irritation about barking dogs interrupting sleep during early morning baking. At first, those side comments seem unrelated and minor.
Then the social pressure begins. A new member notices that when someone says, "The noise problem in this neighborhood is getting ridiculous," people nod. When someone says, "Honestly, people should control their dogs better," that also gets approving reactions. The new member may not feel strongly about that topic. They came to talk about bread, but they also want to fit in. So maybe they laugh. Maybe they'd say, "Yeah, that's true." Not because they deeply thought it through, but because the group seems to reward that kind of agreement.
Then the shift continues. Over time, those side comments stop being side comments. They become an important part of the group culture. A person who originally joined to discuss baking now hears members saying things like, "Bad dog owners are ruining neighborhoods," or "This city is just too soft on pet control," or even worse, "Some kinds of people are always the problem." The discussion is drifting. It's no longer just about bread, but because the shift happened gradually and because agreement has become socially rewarded, many members do not stop and say, "Wait a minute. How did we get from rye bread and starters to policing animals and blaming whole categories of people?" That is how groupthink nudges people, not usually in one dramatic leap, but in a series of small social steps.
Yeah, exactly. The new member may tell themselves, I'm just being polite, or I don't want to make this awkward, or I'm only half agreeing. But the group interprets silence or mild agreement as support. Then stronger voices feel emboldened. Then the acceptable range of opinions shifts even further. So someone may propose something more extreme like, there should be strict animal crackdowns, or certain pets should be banned from neighborhoods, or people who can't control animals should be heavily punished. At that point, a person who came for bread baking may find themselves nodding along with a much more radical conversation than they would ever have embraced on their own at the start.
And that's why groupthink can be dangerous. It doesn't always begin with obviously extreme ideas. It often begins with a desire to belong, a reluctance to challenge, and the mistaken belief that other people must really believe what they're saying. Then in each person's silence strengthens the next person's confidence. One person thinks everyone's here seems to agree, but in reality, several people may privately feel uncertain. No one wants to be the first to object, so the illusion of agreement grows stronger than the actual agreement.
And once that happens, people can start saying things that are more extreme than their original values because the group gives them social cover. That's especially important for younger people to understand. You may not join a group because you believe all its side attitudes. You may join because you like bread, gaming, music, fitness, politics, volunteering, religion, or animals. But if the group becomes tightly bound by a sense of belonging, grievance, and pressure to conform, it can lead people to adopt statements and behaviors that have little to do with the original reason that they came in the first place.
Groups often form around one practical or ordinary purpose and then become vehicles for much broader social attitudes, resentments, exclusions, and crusades. That's why we historians pay close attention not just to formal ideology, but to tone, incentives, rituals of agreement, and the real or symbolic penalties for dissent. The group does not radicalize merely because somebody has a theory. It radicalizes because belonging becomes tied to repetition, repetition becomes tied to identity, and identity becomes tied to enforcement.
So let's state it clearly. The bubble effect isolates the person or leader in the center by filtering truth. Groupthink changes the behavior of the surrounding group by rewarding agreement and discouraging objection. Sycophants help create both of those. They help build the leader's bubble and teach the group that praise and conformity are safer than honesty. That is why these are not separate topics. They are connected parts of the same social machinery.
And once that machinery is running, the danger is not only that the leader becomes misinformed, the danger is also that ordinary members become less independent, less careful, and more easily nudged into saying or supporting things they might once have considered unreasonable, unfair, or unrelated to the group's original purpose.
Which means a person can lose themselves two ways at once. One person loses themselves by flattering upward, another loses themselves by conforming sideways. In both cases, truth weakens and social pressure strengthens.
Well, okay. Let's end part one with a crisp summary. The term sycophant began in ancient Greece with meanings tied to malicious accusation or informing. And in English, it drifted towards the flatterer who hovers near power. Today, a sycophant is best understood as a self interested flatterer who sacrifices honest judgment for approval or advantage. People are not simply born sycophants. Some traits may predispose them, but the behavior is strongly shaped by incentives, fear, dependence, and status systems. And the cost to the person is quite serious, actually. Self-silencing, emotional strain, moral compromise, loss of competence, and eventually a damaged relationship with truth itself. The bubble effect is what happens when truth is filtered around a leader or central figure, leaving that person living in a flattering or protective environment bubble. Groupthink occurs when a group becomes so focused on belonging and treatment that members stop testing ideas honestly and start reinforcing one another's drift. Together, sycophancy, bubble effect, groupthink can quietly transform both people and institutions.
In other words, sycophancy may look useful in the moment, but it often hollows out the person practicing it and destabilizes the larger system around them.
It's one of those behaviors, almost like an addiction, that can bring a short term reward while planting the seeds for long term ruin.
And that's why it matters to study it early before people mistake it for loyalty, professionalism, survival wisdom, or harmless group belonging.
All right. Hey, that's part one of our series on sycophants. Please come back for part two. We get into some other very interesting things, other sides of this issue. So we'll see you then. Bye for now.